Here to dive into industry trends with leading ETF experts, this is ETF Spotlight with Nina Mishra.
Hello and welcome to ETF Spotlight. I'm your host Nina Mishra. My guests today are Andrew Chenin, Bob Tull, and Micah Walter Range. We're talking about the space economy and the Procure Space ETF, ticker UFO. Andrew and Bob are co-founders of Procure AM, UFO's issuer, and Micah is a global space economy expert who developed the index that UFO follows. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So, Andrew, I wanted to start with you. You are well known in the ETF industry for sponsoring the cybersecurity ETF hack, which had gathered $1.4 billion in just 8 months, making it one of the most successful ETF launches ever. So tell us, why did you decide to launch an ETF focused on space?
Space has been an industry that I've always been fascinated by. And in the back of my mind, every time I had created a new product, people would always inevitably ask me, what's next? What's next? What's next? And in the back of my mind, I had been thinking space was one of these areas that I think people want to get investment exposure to. And we've seen it on the private side. And we believe that there are investors that are interested in investing in it that can't access private investments. So really what was important was to see this kind of perfect alignment of the stars on our end. And that alignment includes several factors. One was that the space industry itself was ready for an ETF such as this. And by that, I mean that there were enough publicly traded companies that had space-related businesses. And then taking it a step further, not only that, but companies that were actually pure play space companies. So companies deriving a large percent of their revenues actually from space or space-based systems. Next, for us, was also wanting to know that we could find the right index. And to us, that may have been one of the most important factors in this entire decision to create UFO. And when we finally came across Micah and S Networks and learned about the tremendous work that they had put into building out a space-related index and getting to meet them and learn from them their experiences and understand their backgrounds and familiarity with the space industry, upon seeing their index and meeting with them, we learned that this was the team that we absolutely wanted to work with. So once we realized that all those pieces were in place, we were excited to push forward and launch UFO.
Okay, excellent. So I have to ask you about the ticker symbol UFO. I think it couldn't have been better. So how did you decide the ticker symbol? Was this the one you knew from the very beginning, or was there a short list of ticker symbols and you finally chose this one?
UFO is really an aha moment for me personally. Mm-hmm. We had kicked around more than 10 ideas, and so our short list wasn't really too short. And when we all sat down and looked at all the possibilities and realizing that UFO was available, I believe it was a 100% group consensus that would be the ticker that we would move forward with.
It's great. It's a great ticker symbol. So space has always captured our imagination because it seems that we still know so little about space. We got the first glimpse of a black hole just a few days back, and that was such an exciting moment. We still do not know whether there is extraterrestrial life, but we know a little bit about the space economy now. I saw a Morgan Stanley report that estimated that the global space industry could generate revenues of $1.1 trillion or even more in 2014, up from just about $350 billion in 2018. So could you tell us a little bit more about the space economy and its growth potential?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So there is the Morgan Stanley report, which you mentioned. There is also one from Bank of America that came out a little while later that pegged the size of the annual space economy at around $2.7 trillion, growing to that over the next 2 to 3 decades. So, clearly these major players think there is a lot of growth remaining in the industry, coming up from around $350 to $400 billion a year. So, as it currently stands, when people think of space, they often think of government activities. But the reality is that if you add together all of the government spending across the entire world, it still only makes up a little less than a quarter of that figure, that annual figure. The other 3/4 is commercial activity, things like manufacturing satellites or launching those satellites for commercial customers as opposed to government customers. But then, by far the largest portion of that commercial revenue comes from services that are provided to people like you and me. I mean, I'm not launching satellites on a regular basis, but I do use satellite television. On my smartphone, I have I don't know how many location-based apps, and if it weren't for the GPS satellites, there would be no signal telling my phone exactly where it is at any given time. So, when you look at that and you look at all of those additional industries that are built on the capabilities that space offers and just how well those industries are growing, you start to get a sense of why people think that the demand for space is going to continue to increase very dramatically over the coming decades.
Right. So we know that some companies like Elon Musk's SpaceX, Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic, and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin, they all are planning to send tourists into space. I read about a Japanese startup that is developing a shooting star creation technology and plans to offer meteors on demand. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, the famous astrophysicist, has claimed that space mining will produce world's first trillionaire. So do you expect things like space tourism, Mars colonization, and asteroid mining to become real things in the next few years?
Space tourism, certainly, and it actually is already something that has happened, and the Russians did it first, although with some help from American companies facilitating the deals. So there have been people who have paid tens of millions of dollars to go and spend a very short amount of time aboard the International Space Station, and that was all facilitated through the Russian Space Agency. So there is demonstrated demand. But then the question is, for those of us who don't want to spend quite that amount of money, is it going to become more accessible, more affordable? And that is the goal of companies like Virgin Galactic, where the ticket prices are measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars rather than tens of millions. And, given the number of people that they do already have signed up and who have paid deposits for those tickets, they have at least a few years of operations before they work through that backlog. So, yes, that part is certainly moving ahead quite nicely. And as you say, Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company, is working on that as well. And then SpaceX, with its ambitions to send people, not just as tourists, but ultimately to stay somewhere like Mars, that is definitely a longer-term prospect. I would not expect to see that in the next few years, but the work is being done to prepare for that. And so, even if ultimately it takes longer than any of us might hope, it's quite likely that many of the capabilities will still be useful. And, if you're only going to Earth orbit, that's still a pretty good trip.
Right.
Even if you don't go to Mars. And then for some of the other industries, I would also add in-space manufacturing is another one that is very interesting. There's a lot that people are doing that's right at the intersection of 3D printing and space technology, and figuring out, what if we can just build things in space rather than having to carry everything up with us? If they get that figured out, then that is a huge game changer for how the space industry operates.
Really?
So asteroid mining, I think, is a little more distant of a prospect, but someday it could be quite possible.
Okay, very interesting. So let's talk about your ETF and the index that it tracks. The ETF holds companies that are involved in space-related industries. And there are many companies in this space. In fact, some of the most innovative companies in this space, I think they are privately held. But you said that you found many pure play publicly traded companies as well that could be included in the index. So tell us how stocks are selected and weighted in this index.
As Andrew mentioned, the goal was to put together an index that would truly reflect space and would not just be a selection of companies that have some small amount of business. Because the reality is the supply chain for the space industry is incredibly vast, and there are many companies that produce a few parts that might go into a spacecraft or something else, but they're not really space companies. So we narrowed the pool down by asking 5 different questions. The first is, was the company the prime manufacturer, the one that was integrating all the components and delivering the end product to a customer? Were they the prime manufacturer of a satellite in the past 5 years? Were they the prime manufacturer or operator of a launch vehicle, a rocket, in the past 5 years? Does the company operate satellites? Is it substantially engaged in manufacturing components for satellites? And then the last one is it substantially engaged in manufacturing ground equipment used with satellites? So, that last question really goes to the heart of many of the devices that we use today. As I mentioned, the GPS chips that go into our phones. If nobody made those, then it wouldn't work.
Right.
We wouldn't have that capability. So that was really the first test, that we had to be able to answer yes to at least one of those questions for a company to be considered eligible. And then we also, in order to ensure that they were substantially engaged, we said, okay, at least 20% of their revenue, or at least $500 million of their revenue, has to come from space businesses. And that's another way of just filtering out so many of those companies that do a little bit of space, but not very much. And then it turned out, as we continued to apply these filters, that there was a very substantial cohort that actually generated 100% of their revenue from space. Most of those are in some form of communications or broadcasting. So, just simply satellite telecommunications, connecting both devices, automated devices and people, and then doing a lot of television distribution. That was the other big one. So there's huge demand for satellite television all around the world, particularly in places that are just developing. The emerging markets, the revenue per customer may not be very high, but there is just such incredible demand for the media content and the news and the information that comes through those channels that growth is still very substantial.
Excellent, and that makes a lot of sense. So I'm looking at the top holdings, and I do some well-known companies: Dish Network, Inmarsat, Garmin. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about some of the top holdings in this ETF?
I'd be happy to. So you called them out, and that is a good sample. Garmin is one of those that I think most people are familiar with, the standalone GPS navigation systems that they made for cars in the early days when GPS was gaining popularity. But now their products are integrated into just about everything you can imagine. There are precision-guided tractors out there operating almost independently in the fields because the service is so good now that you can do that. You can say, well, I just need the tractor to go out and plow this field, and here's the path, and off it goes. And fantastic uses for surveying and mapping and inventory tracking as well. Then, yes, you have the communications companies, and Inmarsat is one of the big ones. And I would like to highlight, too, that we weren't just looking at U.S. Listed companies. So Inmarsat is on the London Stock Exchange. Another one, Speedcast International, is Australian. And Airbus, now we're shifting from the pure play ones over to the diversified companies. Airbus, obviously, is not a U.S. company, but they do a tremendous amount of space work, primarily in Europe, but also selling to the global market, because it is a truly global industry.
So UFO is not the only space ETF available to investors. Last year, State Street had launched the Spider Kensho Final Frontiers ETF. That focuses on both space and deep sea exploration. So could you please tell us how different is UFO from XKFF, which is the Spider product, and from other aerospace and defense ETFs?
Well, I think if you go back to what Micah was speaking towards and you look at the indexes, I'm not the be-all and end-all to speak towards another product, but looking at the composition of the index of that other product that you mentioned, it's very heavily weighted in its top holdings. You'll see in some of these companies that our index metrics would look at as maybe a diversified company, maybe specializing in aerospace and defense. And for us, when partnering with our index provider, we didn't want a fund or the index to look like an aerospace and defense index, because there already were aerospace and defense funds. Right. And for us to just slap a name like space onto a fund that had an extremely high correlation to already existing aerospace and defense related products wouldn't really be providing anything of benefit to investors. And for us, it was really knowing that our index provider was looking at the global space industry. So you're looking for companies that were listed on exchanges around the world for a start, as well as trying to determine what these pure play companies are and skewing towards these pure play companies as well. So I don't think from anything that I've seen that there are any products in the market that have the same composition of underlying names in it. So I think you truly are getting a unique, diversified exposure to companies from around the world that are specializing in all different areas of the space economy. So that's how I would see as a major differentiator. And someone that's trying to compare other funds, I would certainly tell them to do a correlation analysis and see are you actually getting different exposures, or are you just investing in something with a trendy name. And I think for us it was very important to come out with something that was defensible on our end for being able to prove that these are truly space and space reliant and space related companies that the index is tracking.
If I could just add to that, just looking at the composition of XKFF, there are maybe 2 or 3 pure play space companies as components, whereas in our space index, 80% of the index weight is assigned to pure play companies. So there's a very substantial difference there. And then for a typical aerospace and defense index or fund, again, it's going to miss out on a lot of the pure play space companies because those are communications or broadcasting. They're not what you would typically think of as aerospace and defense. So I do agree with Andrew that it is a very different set of companies and is of interest on those grounds.
Anything else investors need to know about investing in space? I do understand it's too early to say whether these investments can produce gravity-defying returns.
Well, certainly, there are risks involved with any industry or theme, and we put many of these risk disclosures in the fund's prospectus. But you kind of touched on it earlier when saying how many people are interested in some of these innovative ideas coming from companies that are still private. And I think one of the neat things to consider is some of these companies might be private, but that doesn't mean that they're not working hand in hand with publicly traded companies in order for them to achieve their various missions or build their technologies. So although someone might want specific exposure to a private company, it's very difficult to be able to make those investments as an individual, whereas some of the companies that are in the underlying index that UFO tracks are assisting some of these private companies, and I'm sure Micah would have several examples to be able to give you to that respect.
Right. So one example would be Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos' company, is manufacturing engines for United Launch Alliance, which is a joint venture between Boeing and Lockheed Martin, two of the publicly listed companies that are components of the index. So you get these collaborative efforts, and particularly for a lot of the challenges that come out of the government, DARPA in particular, what you often see is one of the newer companies partnering up with an established publicly traded one, because that way you get the combination of the innovation and the new ideas and the vast wealth of experience that has been built up over decades of operating in space, which is still quite challenging, even though it has gotten easier in recent years. One other thing I would like to add, though, is the U.S. government is very keen to see the space industry grow. The Department of Commerce in particular and the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, has taken a personal interest in getting to that $1 trillion mark as quickly as possible. So they're trying to make the regulatory processes quick and easy as possible for space companies that want to just go out and do things and not have to spend months or years negotiating with government to get the permissions that they need in order to do those things. So, between that and the challenge from the president to hurry up and go to the moon, and also to develop a space force on the military side, there's just so much happening, no matter which part of the space industry you look at, that it's going to be very exciting over the next few years to see how all of that continues to develop and grow.
Yeah. There's a new space race going on, it seems. You mentioned that U.S. is planning to return astronauts to the moon by 2024, and even other countries like Russia, Japan, China, they're also planning to send astronauts to the moon in the next decade or so. And India has also been doing a lot in this area. So definitely many exciting developments. So that's all we have time for today. Andrew, Bob, and Micah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Thanks everyone for listening. Make sure to be on the lookout for next edition of ETF Spotlight, and also make sure to subscribe. If you have any comments or questions, please email podcast@zacks.com.